Imagine you're a South Korean spy in the mid-1990s. Your code name is Black Venus. You've been sent to Beijing with a dangerous mission. Get close to high-ranking North Korean officials and figure out what they're planning.
Right, the classic espionage setup.
Exactly. You're expecting to uncover military secrets, maybe intelligence about their nuclear program, the usual high-stakes game of espionage between two countries technically still at war.
Standard operating procedure, basically.
So you create the perfect cover.
Yeah.
A savvy businessman looking for investment opportunities, trying to convince the North to let you film commercials on their pristine landscapes.
Yeah.
It works. You get in.
Okay.
You're sitting in the same lavish hotels, observing the same secret meetings, but what you start to see doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
How so? The North Koreans aren't meeting with arms dealers from the Middle East or Russian scientists. They're meeting with prominent politicians and intelligence officials from your own country, South Korea.
Wait, from the South, meeting North Koreans secretly.
Yes. You watch from a distance as men who are supposed to be sworn enemies sit down together. You see briefcases full of cash passed from the South Korean side to the North.
Whoa, okay, that's unexpected.
It's completely illogical. Why would your country's leaders be secretly paying the enemy? You were sent to uncover a threat from the North, but you've just stumbled onto something far stranger, a conspiracy where the lines between friend and foe seem to have completely dissolved.
And that right there is the perfect explosive entry point into what we are unpacking today. We're going deep into the heart of South Korean political intrigue, focusing specifically on this event known as the North Wind conspiracy.
The North Wind, got it.
Our mission here is to understand not just the shocking details of the espionage itself, but how this real-life plot, where a democratic nation's intelligence agency pays its sworn enemy for domestic political favors, is totally tied up with the structural fragility of South Korean democracy and also the enduring immense power of its presidency, and how these turbulent political realities shape everything from geopolitical strategy to popular cinema and social relationships. We are basically offering you the shortcut to understanding the persistent flaws within an otherwise consolidated democracy.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of this operation then. It sounds like something out of a movie, but you're saying this is all documented fact. Mm-hmm. Black Venus, this spy under his businessman cover.
Right.
He was doing his job, but stumbled onto this act of political self-sabotage by his own government. What was the thinking? Why did the ANSP director think paying North Korea was a sensible, necessary step to win an election back home?
Well, the thinking was pure electoral cynicism. It was operating within a political culture where using national security threats for domestic gain had sort of become, almost standard practice.
Standard practice.
To some extent, yes. Black Venus confirmed that high-ranking officials from the Agency for National Security Planning, the ANSP, were meeting secretly with North Korean counterparts in China precisely to stop the opposition from gaining power. The target was Kim Dae-jung, who, heading into the 1997 presidential election, was really surging in popularity.
So the goal was to cook up a security crisis, this North Wind scheme, just enough to spook the voters into picking the safe incumbent party.
Precisely. They wanted North Korea to orchestrate staged, kind of low-level border incidents or threats right at crucial moments, like when Kim Dae-jung's poll numbers looked good.
Manufactured instability.
Exactly. Designed to trigger what's often called the security vote in South Korea. It's this historical tendency for voters, when they suddenly feel threatened by North Korea, to rally around the conservative Security First Party.
And this wasn't just a vague plan. There was actual money involved. Black Venus documented it. You mentioned $200,000 passed directly to Pyongyang, not through shell companies or anything.
That sum was confirmation, yeah. It showed they weren't just hoping for some vague instability. They were literally purchasing fake allegations against Kim Dae-jung.
Fake allegations? What kind?
The ANSP wanted the North to publicly accuse Kim Dae-jung of being, a communist sympathizer or having secret ties to Pyongyang. They'd use the manufactured border incident as the backdrop, the justification. The money was to get those specific public accusations made.
Wow.
And you have to realize, $200,000 back in the mid-90s, that was a serious amount of money. And it represented this profound breach of trust using South Korean taxpayer money to basically enroach the enemy state and rig your own election.
Okay, so here's where the story turns, right? The spy mission shifts from just watching this unfold to actually stopping it. The conspiracy fell apart because Black Venus got the evidence.
And the evidence was absolutely critical. The documented meetings, the money transfers, the specific plans, it was all there. He successfully leveraged the threat of exposing the whole thing.
So he threatened to go public.
Essentially, yes. By the time the election rolled around in 1997, the planned security scares couldn't happen without a massive risk of the entire conspiracy blowing up in their faces. The scheme basically crumbled.
And without that manufactured crisis.
Kim Dae-jung won the election. It was actually the first time in South Korean history that power peacefully transferred from the ruling Conservative Party to the opposition. So the intelligence mission that was supposed to uncover external threats ended up stopping a major internal one.
The fallout inside the ANSP must have been enormous. I mean, the agency's top leadership completely exposed.
Oh, it was seismic. The ANSP director, Kwon Young-hae, he admitted his role in the whole thing. The pressure, institutionally and personally, must have been immense because he actually attempted suicide during the prosecution's interrogation in March 1998.
Good grief. Did he?
He survived, but was later sentenced to 5 years in prison. His personal breakdown really reflected this deeper institutional rot that the new government just couldn't sweep under the rug.
So, the new president, Kim Dae-jung, how did his administration deal with this massive failure in the security apparatus?
They knew just changing the wallpaper wouldn't cut it. In February 1999, the whole agency was fundamentally reorganized and renamed the National Intelligence Service, the NIS. You still hear that name today?
Right, the NIS.
And this came with a significant internal house cleaning. Around 40 officials who were involved in the North Wind operation were purged, removed from the service. The idea was to get rid of that old guard, the ones who saw the agency's main job as keeping the ruling party in power rather than, focusing on actual external threats.
But changing a name and firing some people, does that really change an institution's deeply ingrained habits? Did the political meddling actually stop?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, the evidence suggests, no, not entirely. Old habits die hard.
Really? Even after all that?
Yeah. Documents apparently leaked as late as July 1998. That's months after the scandal broke, even before the full reforms were done, showing the new NIS was still preparing and circulating internal reports. And these reports were about how to counter criticisms against the new Kim Dae-jung government.
Wow. So basically doing the same thing, just for a different president.
It certainly looked that way, and it stirred up immediate controversy. It just showed how deeply embedded this idea of domestic political management was within the agency's culture, its operational DNA. The fight wasn't over just because the name changed.
This whole North Wind scandal, it really shines a light on just how, volatile and maybe fragile South Korea's journey to democracy has been. This wasn't just a one-off crazy event, was it? Mm-hmm. It feels like it has deeper roots in the country's political history.
Oh, absolutely. You have to see this through the lens of history. Since the Korean War, South Korea has been wrestling with this incomplete democratic consolidation. You had decades of disguised military rule, like the really brutal Fifth Republic under Chun Doo-hwan. Right. And then there was outright manipulation of elections, like Park Chung-hee winning through massive fraud back in 1971 against, guess who? Kim Dae-jung.
Ah, so there's a history there.
A long history. For decades, the electoral system was often just a tool for the ruling elites to keep themselves in power, not really a way for people to express their will. So when democracy finally started to take stronger root in the late 80s, the institutions themselves were pretty weak, scarred by all that past authoritarianism.
In that historical context, that weakness, it leads us right to this idea of the imperial presidency, doesn't it? A lot of scholars say that's still the core structural problem in the South Korean system.
Absolutely. The imperial presidency is the key institutional flaw that kind of makes something like North Wind even possible. In South Korea, the president still is the single most powerful policymaker. Often, their constitutional and practical powers actually go way beyond those of the U.S. president.
Really? More powerful than the U.S. president?
Well, it's a combination of factors. First, the president has enormous appointment power over key government bodies. They can influence the judiciary and, critically, the prosecution service. That lets them ensure loyalty and sometimes shield allies from investigation.
Okay, control over investigations, that's big.
Huge. Second, they effectively control the entire government bureaucracy and can submit budgets directly to the National Assembly. Third, and this is important, it's cultural too. There's this ingrained habit of deference to authority, hierarchy, these pervasive patron-client networks.
Like loyalty networks.
Exactly. And they really bolster the president's power no matter who's actually in the Blue House. So you put all that together, and the checks and balances, while they exist on paper, are often pretty weak in practice. This gives the person in charge immense leverage over the whole state apparatus, including the intelligence agency, whether it's called ANSP or NIS.
And that weakness in checks and balances is then made worse by the fact that the political parties themselves seem incredibly unstable.
That's the other side of the coin, absolutely. The party system shows really low institutionalization. I mean, the average organizational age of a South Korean political party is remarkably low, something like only 31.5 months.
Wait, 31 and a half months? That's barely 2.5 years.
Exactly. Think about that. Before a party can even really develop deep ideological roots or, solid organizational structure, it's already dissolving or merging or renaming itself. It's like they're stuck in perpetual political adolescence.
So it creates this constant churn, this instability.
It creates an environment where stability is always shaky. These parties are highly personality-driven, very clientelistic. They're built around these vast networks and factions, usually centered on a charismatic leader who controls access to political jobs and resources.
So they're not really about consistent ideas, more like vehicles for powerful individuals.
Largely, yes. They aren't autonomous organizations rooted in ideology. They're often tools for personal ambition. And this intense factionalism creates rational reasons for parties to constantly split and merge, which just feeds into this endemic government instability.
Okay, so if the parties are weak and constantly shifting, the only real stable source of power is the executive office, the presidency itself.
Precisely.
So the system itself kind of rewards the individual in power, creating conditions where an incumbent or their intelligence agency might actually see an extreme measure, like the North Wind conspiracy, as a sort of necessary evil to stay in control in this fundamentally unstable landscape.
That's the crucial insight, I think. The conspiracy wasn't just some random act of villainy by a few bad apples. It was arguably a symptom, a consequence of a structural defect in the system. The struggle for real democratic consolidation in South Korea isn't just external against the threat from the North. It's also internal against systemic corruption and the misuse of executive power that's enabled by this imperial presidency and the weak personality-driven party system.
So the collapse of the North Wind conspiracy, it wasn't just a domestic scandal. It actually paved the way for a completely new strategy towards North Korea, didn't it? Kim Dae-jung's victory led directly to the famous Sunshine Policy. Let's talk about how that engagement policy changed things, seemingly overnight.
The shift was immediate and pretty profound, yeah. Kim Dae-jung basically rejected the old antagonistic approach. He adopted this policy of engagement built on two main ideas: firmness with inducements and, crucially, separating politics from economics.
Firmness with inducements. What does that mean practically?
It meant maintaining a strong defense posture, the firmness, while simultaneously building extensive economic and social ties, the inducements. The goal was to create a relationship where dialogue and interdependence, not confrontation, became the norm. Let's try to build trust through business and people-to-people contact.
And did it work? Did activity actually increase?
Oh, absolutely. The data shows it almost instantly. In just the first 4 months of 1998, you had 404 South Korean citizens travel north. Compare that to only 209 for the entire previous year.
Wow, nearly double in just 4 months.
Exactly. And this growing exchange was powerfully symbolized and also economically driven by the Hyundai Group.
Ah, yes, Hyundai's role. Everyone remembers that iconic image of their honorary chairman, Chung Ju-young, crossing the DMZ, right?
That image is unforgettable. Chung Ju-young, this titan of South Korean industry, crossing the heavily fortified border in 1998 with a convoy carrying 500 cattle. It was meant to symbolize hope, economic aid, not military threat. His visits and the negotiations that followed were pivotal. The biggest deal was the Diamond Mountain Tourism Project.
Let's break down that Diamond Mountain deal, because that involved significant cash flowing north, which was a key part of the inducement strategy, right?
Absolutely. Under that agreement, Hyundai got exclusive rights to run cruise ships bringing South Korean tourists to the North's Cheongjeon port. This opened up a major new source of hard currency for Pyongyang. Hyundai agreed to pay the North a flat fee, $300 for every single tourist.
$300 per person.
Per person. And on top of those fees, Hyundai also committed to giving the North a pretty substantial loan, totaling $19.2 million over 5 years.
Okay, that's serious money. How did the Kim Dae-jung government justify that, especially given the history?
Well, it was politically controversial, of course. Hardliners screamed about funding the enemy. But the administration argued that this massive private sector investment was a way to increase North Korea's economic dependence on the South. The thinking was, if they rely on us for cash, they're less likely to start a military conflict, make them stakeholders in peace, essentially.
But this whole engagement policy, the sunshine policy, it eventually ran headlong into the really tough issue of denuclearization, didn't it? That quickly became the major sticking point.
That's where the consensus really fractured. And honestly, it continues to divide regional powers even today. The core problem is that the U.S. and North Korea have fundamentally opposing views on how denuclearization should actually happen.
Right, different definitions almost.
Exactly. North Korea pushes for what they call cooperative denuclearization. Pyongyang says, okay, we'll take phased reciprocal steps, meaning they take a verifiable action, like maybe shutting down a test site.
Okay.
And in return, the international community, led by the U.S., has to immediately ease sanctions. They argue the U.S. position is basically just demanding surrender without offering anything fair in return.
And the U.S. stance is much tougher, demanding everything up front.
Correct. Washington insists on coercive denuclearization, which is built around this concept called FFVD, final, fully verified denuclearization.
FFVD.
It means all nuclear programs have to be dismantled, completely verified by international experts, and proven irreversible before any major sanctions relief even gets considered. Washington remains deeply skeptical about Pyongyang's sincerity and whether their actions can actually be verified.
Like the Punggye test site closure.
That's a perfect example. North Korea blew up the entrances to the Punggye site, but they only invited journalists to watch. They specifically kept nuclear experts away. So from the U.S. perspective, that immediately undercut the verified part of FFVD. How do we know what really happened?
So South Korea, especially under President Moon later on, got caught in the middle, trying to mediate, sometimes moving faster than the U.S., their main ally, was comfortable with.
Exactly. President Moon really prioritized improving inter-Korean relations quickly. He focused on tangible projects you could see connecting cross-border railways, disarming parts of the joint security area at the border.
Things that showed progress.
Right, things that showed progress to the north. But this speed created significant skepticism, especially in Washington and among foreign press. They worried Seoul was sort of gambling with its security alliance, moving too fast without fully aligning its pace with U.S. demands on the nuclear front.
And this friction, this difference in approach, it seems to have hardened into a clearer geopolitical split in the region now, almost like two opposing camps.
It has become starkly divided, yes. You've got one pole, the U.S. and Japan, generally holding a firm, hard line focused on sanctions and FFVD.
Okay.
And opposing them, you have this alignment of North Korea, China, and Russia. China, under Xi Jinping, has deliberately strengthened ties with Pyongyang. A big motivation there is boosting China's regional influence relative to America, and maybe hedging against a future where U.S. troops might withdraw from Korea. China sees the peninsula very strategically.
And Russia's motivation, is it also strategic or more economic?
Russia seems primarily driven by economic opportunity, at least initially. They resumed exports using the North Korean port of Najin, looking for clear economic benefits from renewed trade and infrastructure links.
So this China-Russia alignment gives North Korea options, lifelines.
Exactly. It provides Pyongyang with economic breathing room, potentially undermining the effectiveness of international sanctions. Meanwhile, the Western powers, especially the European permanent members of the UN Security Council, think France and the UK remain pretty firm. They resist easing the 9 existing UN Security Council resolutions against North Korea.
Why are those 9 UN resolutions so important, and why are France and the UK so resistant to easing them?
Those 9 resolutions are critical because they form the backbone of the international sanctions regime. They collectively stress that denuclearization has to come before any significant economic aid or the lifting of major sanctions.
So no rewards before verifiable action.
That's the principle. By resisting calls to ease them prematurely, powers like France and the UK align with the U.S. hardline stance. Sanctions are the main leverage we have, and that leverage shouldn't be given up until North Korea takes concrete, verifiable, irreversible steps on denuclearization. So the global diplomatic front remains fundamentally split on the best way forward. It just highlights how hard it is to break this deadlock between engagement and coercion.
Okay, so we've laid out this picture of deep instability at the top. Intelligence agency corruption, the imperial presidency, volatile geopolitics.
Yeah.
Let's shift focus now to how these intense political realities filter down and affect South Korean society and culture. We need to talk about this faction phenomenon, the way fiction and fact get blurred, especially in movies.
The faction genre is huge here, yeah, because it's where history, pop memory, and political viewpoints really collide, often quite violently. When a real, genuinely shocking event like the Black Venus operation gets turned into a big movie, like The Spy Gone North.
Which was based on this story, right?
Exactly. These films become cultural battlegrounds. They use real history, sometimes disputed facts based maybe only on one person's account, to create intense drama.
And when a film seems to take a political side, the criticism gets really intense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Especially if it's seen as, say, romanticizing North Korea or being too critical of South Korea's conservative past.
Oh, the criticism can be ferocious. And it's often driven by what you might call an excessive expectation for accuracy from the audience.
Excessive expectation.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic. People often turn to fiction, to movies, to sort of study history. They expect a commercial film, something made by specific people with their own biases, under commercial pressures to function like an objective, unbiased historical documentary. They end up confusing a narrative product with an actual historical record.
So instead of discussing the movie's themes like corruption or moral choices, people get bogged down arguing about whether every single historical detail is perfectly accurate.
That's often what happens. For instance, The Spy Gone North got slammed by critics who felt it deliberately misrepresented the conservative side and pushed a more progressive view, maybe by making the North Korean threat seem less severe. This intense focus on perceived historical distortion really shows how fragile public trust can be in the official historical narrative, especially after conspiracies like North Wind prove the government itself has lied and manipulated things for political gain.
So faction films become almost a substitute way for people to search for truth.
In a way, yeah. They become arenas for debating the past because the official channels are sometimes seen as compromised.
This struggle over representation, over who gets to tell the story accurately, it connects directly to other social tensions, doesn't it? Like the prejudice and xenophobia faced by the Korean Chinese population in South Korea.
That's a really important and complex issue, rooted in prejudice. The Korean Chinese population, most of whom originally came from the Yanbian region in China, face these pervasive negative stereotypes and quite a bit of xenophobia in South Korea. They're often unfairly viewed as potential criminals or a source of social instability.
And you see that stereotype reinforced in media, right?
Yeah.
Especially in certain movie genres like gritty crime thriller.
Precisely. You get these high-profile, often tragic crimes involving maybe one individual, like the Wonchano murder case, and they become huge national news. That gets sensationalized, and then you combine it with how Korean Chinese characters are often depicted in popular films, think The Yellow Sea or The Outlaws. They're frequently linked to things like human trafficking, extreme violence, organized crime.
Creating this image of them as inherently dangerous.
Exactly. It reinforces this aggressive, dangerous stereotype that is just miles away from the reality of the vast majority of the community.
But if you actually look at the crime statistics objectively, they tell a different story, don't they?
They really do. If you take the 2016 data, for example, yes, Korean Chinese individuals committed about 61.3% of crimes committed by foreigners. That sounds alarming on its own.
Right, that number jumps out.
But you absolutely have to put it in context. At that time, the Korean Chinese population made up more than half of the entire foreign population living in Korea. So when you calculate the crime rate per capita per 100,000 people, the rate for Korean Chinese was only about 3%. That's actually similar to other foreign groups. The negative stereotype relies on misreading the raw numbers and ignoring population size.
And there's an economic but heavily on this group. It highlights a kind of societal hypocrisy.
It's a crucial economic relationship, yeah. Korean industry depends significantly on Korean Chinese workers to fill what are often called the 3D jobs: difficult, dangerous, and dirty. Jobs that many native-born Koreans tend to avoid.
Okay.
And beyond just labor, they serve as this vital cultural and linguistic bridge. They act as translators, essential contacts for Korean companies trying to expand into the huge, complex Chinese market. They leverage their bilingual skills, their cultural understanding. So maintaining a stable, positive environment for this population is actually an economic necessity for South Korea. The persistence of these unfair stereotypes is really counterproductive to the country's own interests.
Let's try to connect this back to the core theme of institutional legitimacy and trust. How does the very idea of patriotism become a contested issue, even in established democracies? Maybe we can use the debate around the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance as a kind of parallel to understand how dissent can sometimes be framed as a form of higher patriotism, and then bring that idea back to the South Korean context.
The pledge controversy in the U.S. is actually a perfect lens for this. It shows how symbols of required patriotism can clash head-on with individual liberty and critical thinking about the state. On one side, you have supporters who equate refusing to salute the flag or say the pledge with disrespecting the nation, disrespecting veterans, and so on.
Right, that's the common argument.
And they point to history. The pledge was written back in 1892, partly to promote unity after the Civil War and help assimilate immigrants. And that controversial phrase, under God, added in 1954, that was explicitly an anti-communist move, seen as defending against the godless Soviet Union.
But the people who refuse to participate, they often argue they're not being disrespectful.
Right.
They frame it differently.
Exactly. Opponents often argue that refusing the pledge can actually be a higher form of patriotism. For those who protest, like that student in Texas, India Landry, who got expelled for sitting during the pledge, the refusal is a form of silent protest. They argue the flag and the pledge don't genuinely represent liberty and justice for all because of the state's own failures, like ongoing systemic racism or injustice.
So their act of dissent isn't against the country's ideals, but against the country's failure to live up to those ideals. It's like they're trying to hold the state accountable.
Precisely. It completely reframes the act. Patriotism, in this view, isn't about blind, uncritical loyalty to a symbol. It's about a fierce commitment to the principles the symbol is supposed to represent. And when the state fails to uphold those principles, then protest becomes a necessary act of civic correction, trying to push the state back towards its own stated values.
That concept of patriotic dissent seems like it would resonate strongly in South Korea, especially given its modern history and experiences like the North Wind conspiracy.
It resonates incredibly deeply. Think about the massive, peaceful citizen movement South Korea has seen, like the candlelight protests that led to President Park Geun-hye's impeachment. Millions gathered peacefully to challenge an imperial presidency that had lost its legitimacy due to corruption.
Demanding better from their own government.
Exactly. That act of demanding better, of challenging the existing power structure to adhere to real democratic values, that's the ultimate expression of patriotic dissent. Very much like protesting the pledge can be in the U.S. context. The North Wind conspiracy, by revealing that the government itself was willing to collude with the supposed enemy to undermine democracy, did profound damage to institutional trust. It made dissent, critical examination of the state's actions, whether through protests, faction films, or challenging social narratives, absolutely essential for the health, even the survival of South Korean democracy.
The struggle for truth, then, is fundamental for legitimacy. You know, what really stands out to me, wrapping this up, is how all these different threads really connect back. We started with this specific spy story, Black Venus, uncovering a conspiracy where South Korean elites paid their enemy to rig an election. Just a monumental betrayal that exposed these deep structural flaws.
Right. And from that single kind of shocking espionage event, we zoomed out to see the bigger picture, the institutional weaknesses that allowed it to happen, the imperial presidency, the unstable personality-driven parties, the cultural deference giving the executive too much unchecked power.
Which then led directly into the geopolitical complexities, the ambitious sunshine policy trying engagement, but then crashing into the hard realities of denuclearization, and this new regional alignment with North Korea, China, and Russia pushing back against the U.S.-led pressure.
And then finally, we looked at the cultural echoes, how state dishonesty fuels this audience obsession with historical accuracy in faction films, how vulnerable groups like the Korean Chinese become scapegoats due to prejudice, and ultimately how dissent itself, whether it's protesting corruption or a mandated pledge, becomes this essential, if challenging, part of any democracy that's genuinely trying to consolidate and live up to its ideals.
It's a complex web.
It really is. And the ultimate takeaway from the North Wind conspiracy, maybe like so many other hidden political truths we uncover throughout history, is this constant, uncomfortable reminder. The line between friend and foe, between political ally and corrupt opportunist, can get incredibly blurry, sometimes dissolving completely behind closed doors. This constant discovery of deception, whether in spying or domestic politics, it forces us, and especially citizens in those countries, to constantly question the stability and the core principles of even supposedly established systems. It highlights that the toughest battle is often not against some external enemy, but against the internal corruption and the systemic misuse of power that can rot a state from within.